Senhoras e senhores, muito boa noite. Sejam bem-vindos à Universidade de São Marcos e ao segundo ciclo do Fórum Permanente Universo do Conhecimento. A TV Cultura, parceira da São Marcos neste projeto, vai documentar essa palestra e vai veicular posteriormente em sua programação. As palestras também poderão ser adquiridas em DVD através do selo Cultura Marcas. Por se tratar de um conteúdo público, a presença dos senhores neste auditório automaticamente concede o direito de imagem à emissora, a TV Cultura. Informamos ainda que o evento está sendo transmitido ao vivo pela internet em 4 endereços através dos sites Universidade São Marcos, Universo do Conhecimento, Universo Brasil e Canal U de Educação e Pesquisa da França. Pedimos a gentileza, por favor, de desligarem seus celulares e aparelhos sonoros durante o evento. Não será permitida a utilização de flashes ou mesmo foto por aparelhos celulares. Solicitamos também aos interessados em elaborar questões para discussão que utilizem as fichas que se encontram em suas pastas. Nossas recepcionistas, posicionadas nas laterais deste auditório, vão recolher as perguntas durante a conferência, a fim de evitar exagerada movimentação, o que prejudicaria a captação das imagens pela televisão. Depois de iniciado o debate, não serão aceitas novas questões. Gostaríamos de aproveitar também para agradecer a presença do magnífico reitor Hernani Bicudo de Paula, dos diretores de pós-graduação, de graduação e de extensão, dos coordenadores de cursos, professores, estudantes e convidados. Neste momento, nós vamos exibir o vídeo Universidade São Marcos, Conhecimento, Ética e Cidadania, produzido pelo curso de Comunicação Social da Universidade de São Marcos, para que os convidados possam conhecer um pouco mais do trabalho realizado por nossa universidade. Vamos ao vídeo, por favor.
A Universidade de Oxford existe há 909 anos. A Universidade de Salamanca existe há 787 anos. A Universidade de Paris 5 existe há 236 anos. A Universidade de São Marcos existe há 36 anos. O rumo está definido. Agora é uma questão de tempo.
Ética, conhecimento e cidadania, voltados para o ensino, pesquisa e extensão, desde a educação infantil, passando pelo ensino fundamental e ensino médio até o ensino superior. São mais de 800 alunos no Colégio São Marcos e cerca de 10.000 universitários cursando ensino superior. A São Marcos é garantia de qualidade no ensino. Fundada em 1970, no bairro do Ipiranga, a Universidade São Marcos oferece cursos nas áreas de Ciências Biológicas e Saúde, Ciências Exatas e da Terra, Ciências Humanas e Sociais, Ciências Sociais Aplicadas, Licenciaturas, Engenharias e Tecnologias. Entre graduação, pós-graduação e extensão, são mais de 100 cursos em 17 unidades de ensino. Dessas unidades, 12 estão instaladas nos históricos prédios do Ipiranga, uma nos Jardins e outra na cidade de Paulínia, que além dos vários cursos, proporcionam também atividades culturais e de apoio à comunidade. A Unidade São Marcos Tatuapé, com capacidade projetada para 4.000 alunos, oferece a conveniência de serviços, como anfiteatros, lojas e praça de alimentação. A Universidade São Marcos é a única a oferecer curso de zootecnia na Grande São Paulo, com uma fazenda experimental em Guararema. Numa iniciativa pioneira, a São Marcos lançou aos portadores de necessidades especiais, tanto visuais, auditivas como motoras, o curso de Educação à Distância em Leitura e Produção de Texto. No município de São Sebastião, o curso de Engenharia Ambiental mantém uma unidade de pesquisa e estudos em preservação de recursos naturais no coração da Mata Atlântica. Para ser reconhecida como centro de excelência de ensino, a São Marcos investe na melhoria de sua infraestrutura, na qualificação de seu corpo docente e em projetos que possibilitem o desenvolvimento científico, cultural e tecnológico da universidade. Com a finalidade de promover ações de cooperação internacional, a São Marcos mantém parcerias com instituições estrangeiras, incentivando o intercâmbio de docentes e alunos e a realização de eventos e seminários internacionais. Oferece também cursos livres de inglês, espanhol e português e conta com uma filial da Aliança Francesa instalada no próprio campus. Outro grande projeto realizado pela Universidade São Marcos é o Universo do Conhecimento, promovendo ciclos de palestras com renomados intelectuais do Brasil e do exterior para a discussão de questões cruciais do mundo contemporâneo, nas áreas de política, ciências e humanidades. O evento foi inaugurado com o sociólogo e ex-presidente, professor Fernando Henrique Cardoso. A Unimarco Editora, com 10 anos de existência, já publicou mais de 90 títulos, imprimindo em média 10.000 exemplares por ano. A Unimarco dá suporte à produção cultural da universidade, sendo responsável por publicações científicas de referência, como a revista Interações e a revista Psique, avaliadas nacionalmente com nota A pela CAPES. O Programa de Iniciação Científica São Marcos, coordenado pela Corpesc, visa despertar o senso da análise crítica e o interesse pela pesquisa. O incentivo à criatividade e ao espírito empreendedor tem como aliada uma estrutura de apoio que conta com mais de 60 laboratórios de última geração. Os alunos transformam o seu aprendizado acadêmico em serviços e atendimento à comunidade através das clínicas de psicologia, fisioterapia e enfermagem, além dos escritórios modelo de direito e arquitetura e juizado especial cível do bairro do Ipiranga. A São Marcos reúne um corpo docente composto por professores titulados, dos quais 74% são mestres ou doutores. Os projetos sociais desenvolvidos pela São Marcos, muitos deles realizados em parceria com empresas, organizações não governamentais ou órgãos públicos, procuram equacionar e propor soluções para as questões da sociedade. O Parceiros da Criança, em conjunto com a GM, atende cerca de 200 crianças na favela de Heliópolis. Vários desses projetos foram reconhecidos e premiados. Plantar e Crescer, desenvolvido no Amazonas, ganhou o primeiro prêmio Petrobras de Universidade Solidária. Universidade Cidadã, Adote uma Escola, conquistou o prêmio Projeto Soluções Rede Globo SPTV e CIEE. O projeto Crucutu ganhou o 9º Prêmio Banco Real.
A Universidade de São Marcos, inspirada no projeto Université de tous les savoirs, organizado pela Universidade Paris 5 Sorbonne, sua parceira institucional, criou no ano passado o Fórum Universo do Conhecimento, com o objetivo de reunir intelectuais do Brasil e do exterior para a discussão de questões cruciais do mundo contemporâneo nas áreas de política, ciências e humanidades. O tema escolhido para as conferências de 2005, esse ano, é Planeta Terra, um olhar transdisciplinar. A proposta deste novo ciclo de palestras é discutir as principais questões que afetam o presente e o futuro da humanidade, tendo como eixo de reflexão o planeta e sua diversidade, o ecossistema e as relações humanas. Para as boas-vindas a todos vocês, anunciamos neste momento as palavras da vice-reitora acadêmica e de Relações Internacionais, Luciane Miranda de Paula.
Boa noite a todos. Eu quero, em nome da Universidade de São Marcos, agradecer a presença do Dr. Thomas Lovejoy nesta noite, que gentilmente aceitou o nosso convite, através do nosso querido consultor, Dr. Paulo Nogueira Neto, para proferir a primeira conferência do Universo do Conhecimento, Planeta Terra, um olhar transdisciplinar. Eu tenho certeza que essa contribuição engrandecerá e muito a compreensão de todos no nosso desafio e responsabilidade enquanto habitantes desse planeta. Quero aproveitar ainda a oportunidade para agradecer a imensa presença cada vez maior dos nossos professores, alunos e da comunidade externa São Marcos. Sem dúvida, isso nos estimula a continuar nosso projeto, nosso trabalho pelo planeta, pela educação e pelo conhecimento. Muito obrigada.
Esta noite, a Universidade de São Marcos tem a honra de receber o biólogo e ambientalista Thomas Lovejoy, que vai apresentar a conferência Biodiversidade, Ciência e Governança. Formado pela Yale University, Thomas Lovejoy é um dos mais importantes formuladores do ambientalismo internacional. Atual consultor-chefe de biodiversidade do Banco Mundial e presidente do Centro de Ciência H. John Heinz III, Lovejoy foi dirigente do Fundo World Wildlife por muitos anos e é um especialista em Brasil, onde morou aqui por 2 anos. Entre suas relevantes contribuições para a questão ambiental, destacam-se a ideia do tamanho crítico mínimo do processo ecossistema e o conceito de troca-débito para a natureza. Senhoras e senhores, com a palavra, o professor Dr. Thomas Lovejoy.
Então, boa noite a todos. Agradeço a oportunidade de dar uma palestra aqui na Universidade de São Marcos. Vou falar em inglês, mas é uma grande honra de estar aqui nessa universidade de grande atividades e grande promessa. Our planet is a living planet. It is the only one we know of, although it is certainly possible that there are others in the universe. But wherever they may be, clearly any others are basically inaccessible. Moving to another planet is essentially impossible. So it behooves us to both know and manage this one more carefully, much more carefully than we do. I find it useful to begin with the acknowledgement, with the basic principle that no organism exists or can exist without affecting its environment. Every organism requires energy in some form to live and grow, and inevitably excretes some waste. Even green plants that rely for energy primarily on sunlight require nutrients in addition and produce waste in the process, although in that case it is primarily oxygen. The point that follows from this for people is that we simply do not have the choice of whether we affect the environment or whether we do not. Instead, the issue in front of society is inherently complicated. It is in what ways and how much do we affect the environment? And that environment is both physical and biological. The diversity of the biological environment is what we term collectively biological diversity, or biodiversity for short. The diversity of species, of the genetics within species, and of the biological communities and formations we term ecosystems. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is a very complex term itself, and it has many facets, many aspects. One can think of it through the lens of time and evolution, in which a single species gives rise to many in an evolutionary radiation, such as the Galapagos finches or the Hawaiian honeycreepers on the screen, deriving from single undifferentiated forms. Or it can be thought of as the total number of species on Earth, of which roughly 1.5 million have been described, or the total amount of sheer living matter or biomass in different groups of animals, or in the number of species in subsets like plants. In either case, it is clear that we vertebrates are very much in the minority, and that the world is pretty much made up of green plants, microorganisms, and invertebrates, a sort of spineless majority, and that we vertebrates are pretty much along for the ride. Biodiversity is also known only superficially. If one compares the two left pie charts, Australian terrestrial vertebrates on the bottom are very much better known than all Australian insects on the top chart. Basically, there has been and is a vertebrate bias in the studies of biodiversity that holds for any nation on Earth. Comparing British insects in the right-hand chart to Australian insects in the top left, you can see that British insects are much better known. Indeed, British natural history is so well developed that I believe it is impossible for a bird to lay an egg in Britain without at least 3 people writing it down. More importantly, this reflects a situation in which generally in the world, the biodiversity of the nations of Europe and North America is more thoroughly understood than in other nations, and particularly in the tropics, where so much of biodiversity occurs. This also touches on the very big question of how much biodiversity is there, or how many species do we share our planet with? When I was a graduate student, the general idea was that the 1.5 million described species might be about 50% of a 3 million species total, or at most perhaps as much as a total of 5 million. Then Smithsonian scientist Terry Irwin sampled beetles in the Amazon forest canopy in Peru and found such a diversity of undescribed beetle species that he estimated the total could be 30 million. Since then, the estimate of the total number of species has bounced around between 10 and 100 million species. But there are simply vast unknowns in the biology of soils, in the biology of the seas, and even in the little tiny fungi called endophils that inhabit the inside of leaves. All of which emphasizes that one of the great scientific projects of all time should be to inventory the variety of life on our planet. It is, in fact, embarrassing that we do not know the answer as to how many species we share the planet with, and a full inventory would be very much in our self-interest. Life on Earth is currently understood to be about 3.7 billion years old. That means each and every organism, each and every one of us in this room, and each and every species has a 3.7 billion year pedigree. Today, what is called the tree of life, and which once very much looked like a tree, is really pretty much a low spreading bush. The tree is made up primarily of microorganisms, with many dating from the early history of life on Earth, many with strange appetites and strange metabolisms. The higher organisms, namely fungi, plants, and animals, are but 3 terminal twigs on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side of the spreading bush. There are also patterns in the distribution of biodiversity. One very basic one is an increasing richness of species from the poles to the equator. In this case, we see at the bottom of the slide that there are but 2 ant species in Tierra del Fuego, but that moving north to Sao Paulo, that number is now 100 times greater. And the equator is still a great distance further. This pattern repeats itself over and over again from one group of organisms to another, with obvious exceptions, of course. There are not more penguins at the equator than in Antarctica. There are also biological formations that hold more biodiversity than others, and prime among them are the tropical forests of the world. They hold a significant fraction of all terrestrial species, maybe as much as half, on the 7% of the dry land surface of the earth where there is sufficient rainfall, and rainfall that is sufficiently distributed throughout the year for rainforests to flourish. Nonetheless, some drier ecoregions, such as the Cerrado, turn out to be impressively rich in species as well. Biodiversity is also a characteristic. Every biological community has both a characteristic species composition and a characteristic level of biodiversity, a characteristic species number. Amazon forests characteristically have many hundreds of tree species. For example, 10 hectares might characteristically have 400 species of trees. In contrast, a forest of Tierra del Fuego or a northern temperate forest would have just a handful of tree species. This aspect of biodiversity as a characteristic proves to be very useful for management purposes, and I will return to that later. Our existence is very much intertwined with biodiversity and dependent upon it in multiple and complex ways. It is an illusion that we are independent. Our daily lives are filled with multiple connections, most of which we ignore or take for granted. How often do we eat something and understand where it comes from? That cashew nuts come just one per fruit, or each castaña de Pará was harvested from the Amazon forest, or what the origin may be of the medicine we buy at the pharmacy. Food, fiber, clothing, and shelter all have significant biological ingredients. There are multiple ways in which we consume directly from nature, such as in this lighthearted example of the botanicals, the multiple plant species that flavor gin. It is, in fact, more complex than that, because a lot of that depends on not just use of wild species or their domesticated descendants, but also on continuing contribution from the wild at the genetic level. The great agricultural research centers for corn, rice, wheat, etc., are continually seeking wild relatives, such as this wild relative of corn from the Mexican state of Michoacan, and looking for useful genes for disease resistance or increased productivity. They are also looking for natural enemies of agricultural pests. An African famine was literally averted when a native predator, I think from Brazil, of the cassava mealybug was identified and introduced to control the pest. The direct contribution of natural resources to economies is not trivial, and they are, of course, to some degree, not substitutable with non-biological resources. An interesting and whimsical example of the contribution of natural resources to the development of the United States economy can be found beneath the streets of Manhattan, where in the Astor Place subway station, named for John Jacob Astor, once the richest person in America, the decoration in the station uses the beaver, the pelts of which contributed hugely to his fortune. Another important contribution biodiversity makes to human society is through the age-old biochemical arms race between insects and their plant food species. Through time and the action of evolution, plants are continually evolving new biologically active compounds, either poisonous or noxious to the herbivorous insects. Insects, in turn, are equally active in developing means to resist or avoid the effects of those compounds. The consequence is that by far the greatest pharmaceutical factory in the world is that of nature, replete with useful molecules pre-tested by evolution to perform a vast diversity of functions. Even in the era of designer molecules, medicines derived from nature loom large. And aspirin, literally the best-selling medicine of all time, while today consisting of a synthetic molecule, is based on the natural template from the willow tree, once prescribed as a painkiller thousands of years ago by Hippocrates. Another related and important aspect of biodiversity, and one very little appreciated, is as the fundamental library for the life sciences. There is a continual series of discoveries and insights about how biological systems work that come from unpredictable sources and, until the moment of discovery, from seemingly esoteric species of no value to anyone. In that way, antibiotics came from a laboratory culture dish contaminated with a penicillium mold related to that which flavors Roquefort cheese, and vaccination came from observation of the immunity cowpox provided milkmaids to smallpox, the great scourge. Literally, more than half of us in this auditorium are alive today because of the medical practices based on those two discoveries. The discovery of the angiotensin system of regulation of blood pressure came from studies right here in São Paulo at Butantan of the venom of a viper, the bushmaster. That knowledge was the necessary precursor to developing the ACE inhibitors, which are fundamental in treating and controlling hypertension. It would be very much in our interest to treat this living library with the same respect we treat libraries of human books. Another very important contribution of biodiversity is as the most sensitive set of indicators of environmental change, alerting us to environmental problems before they affect human beings. So when the peregrine falcon disappeared east of the Mississippi in the United States, it was an indicator of serious misuse of chlorinated hydrocarbons as pesticides. And when amphibian biologists noticed 15 years ago that frog species were disappearing all over the world, it indeed deserved the front page coverage it received in the Washington Post. In recent years, there has been more recognition of the contributions from biodiversity in the form of ecosystem services. The contributions made by the biodiversity constituting an ecosystem in, for example, generating soil fertility, because soil is really a living system. Yet another example is pollination of domestic crops by wild species. When alfalfa was planted in New Zealand, the crop failed until the right species of bee was brought for pollination. And very late last year, when the tsunami hit with such dreadful effects in Asian oceans, those areas which had not destroyed their mangroves and still had coral reefs were far less affected than those which had allowed that environmental damage. So there often is disaster prevention as an ecosystem service. And most recently, the ability of wetlands and barrier islands to protect New Orleans was seriously reduced by human changes to the Mississippi River and the way it flows and treats its floodplain, which certainly augmented the impact of Hurricane Katrina. A few years ago, when I was invited to brief Australian Prime Minister John Howard and his Science, Technology and Innovation Council on biodiversity, of everything I said, it was clearly an ecosystem service story, namely that of the New York City watershed, which most caught the Prime Minister's attention. When I was a child growing up in Manhattan, we had wonderful, delicious water. So good, it would win in blind tastings against fancy bottled waters like French Evian. The Catskill Mountain watershed that was the primary source of the city water deteriorated over time from land use change, finally to a point that the United States Environmental Protection Agency was about to require New York City to build a major multi-billion-dollar water treatment facility. But someone was smart enough to realize that restoring the watershed to the point where biodiversity could once again perform its role in water purification was not only a better and more permanent, but also a more inexpensive solution. That became the solution at 1/10 the cost of building the water treatment facility. Former Quito Mayor Roque Sevilla rightly calls watershed forests water factories. And in Costa Rica, owners of forests receive government income for providing the watershed service. A prime example of an ecosystem service in Brazil is the support of the Amazon fisheries because of the nutrient transfer in high water months from the floodplain forests to the fish. 3/4 of the fish species in the Amazon, of which the tambaqui is first and foremost, depend primarily for nutrition on the nuts and seeds and other organic matter that falls into the water when those forests are flooded. Zoning of those floodplains to ensure the continuity and productivity of those fisheries is a major challenge for environmental policy. An even more important ecosystem service involves the hydrological cycle of the Amazon. That cycle literally generates half or more of the Amazon's rainfall by recycling as water evaporates off the complex surfaces of the forest and is transpired by the trees to the air masses as they move westward. Some of this moisture even makes an important contribution to rainfall as far south as Argentina. Obviously, it is of critical importance for Brazil to maintain the integrity of the cycle. It is no secret that biodiversity is being lost rapidly almost everywhere in the world, and that we are at what is the beginning of what could be the 6th great extinction in the history of life on Earth. We are affecting biodiversity in a number of ways. One way, the original way, is through over-harvest. For example, modern fishing has led to the disappearance of 90% of the big predatory fish in the oceans. An example of over-harvest in the United States is the extinction of this bird, the passenger pigeon, a bird that literally had a population in the billions. A Brazilian example could be the story of Pau Brasil. This is an old and widespread story in our history and in our prehistory. For example, in the Hawaiian Islands, many bird species, same Hawaiian honeycreepers, many bird species were driven to extinction by the Polynesian inhabitants long before the arrival of Captain Cook and other Europeans. So this is not just a story of modern historic period human activity. Another driving force, and perhaps still the greatest, is habitat destruction that has led to the loss of most of the grasslands in the United States, 80% of the Cerrado in Brazil, and to tropical deforestation. And habitat destruction is almost always accompanied by habitat fragmentation, as in the sequence of images of Mata Atlântica in Bahia, starting with 1945, 1960, and 1990. Habitat fragmentation has only been appreciated as a problem in the last 25 years or so. For example, the forest fragment study of IMPA and the Smithsonian north of Manaus has shown that 50% of forest interior bird species disappear from 100 hectare fragments in less than 15 years. 50% of forest interior bird species disappear from the 100 hectare fragments in less than 15 years. Another way in which we affect biodiversity is by facilitating, often without intending to, is by facilitating the transport of species to places where they do not occur naturally. There, some of them thrive at the expense of native species. This problem of invasive species, of alien species, is now recognized as the third most important factor reducing biodiversity globally. This actually very beautiful comb jellyfish from the Atlantic coastal waters of the Western Hemisphere made its way in ballast water to the Black Sea about 1980. There, its population exploded by short-circuiting the food chain until its biomass was equal to that of the $250 million anchovy fishery that it replaced. The only known species of this little extinct, specimens of this little extinct Stephen Island wren from the South Pacific were actually collected by the lighthouse keeper's cat. Pollution has a major impact on wild species. As mentioned, DDT and other chlorinated hydrocarbons led to the near disappearance of many bird species in the United States, including the United States national bird, the bald eagle. Nitrogen and other forms of pollution from agriculture lead to major pollution of freshwaters, as we see here in an image of the Mississippi drainage. Today, the amount of nitrogen biologically available on a global basis is twice the natural level. And a major consequence is a dead zone, such as we see down here in the Gulf of Mexico, an oxygen-free zone in which almost no living things can survive. But it's not just the Mississippi. There are a number of dead zones in estuarine and coastal waters around the world with their oxygen-depleted waters and collapsed fisheries. In the United States, we had problems with sulfur primarily from burning coal, leading to acid rain and acid lakes. And I once had the opportunity to visit Cubatão, where the pollution from the refineries had so degraded the vegetation on the adjacent Serra do Mar that all trees were dead and there were consequent landslides. The big challenge in the end is that everything that we consider an environmental problem affects biodiversity. Biodiversity functions in a way in which it integrates the effects of all environmental problems. The main advantage from that fact is that it means we can use biodiversity as a characteristic, as a measure of our overall impact on the environment. This was recognized 50 years ago, actually more than 50 years ago, by the remarkable Ruth Patrick, now aged 97, of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Ruth was able to demonstrate that the number and kinds of species in freshwater streams and rivers reflected both the natural condition plus the effects of human activities in the watershed. This Patrick principle, using biodiversity to measure impact, is regularly used to measure water pollution impact and improvement. The principle holds on land and in the sea as well, and allows us to use this aspect of biodiversity as a characteristic for environmental measurement and management. But this same sort of integrating aspect in which biodiversity essentially integrates all environmental problems means that biodiversity conservation and management are inherently hugely difficult, because it means we have to manage all the environmental problems. But this does lead to this next section, a consideration, the important consideration of what can be done to overcome the negative trends. A core element of any approach to conserve biodiversity is a system of protected areas. Brazil has such a system under the Sistema Nacional de Unidades de Conservação, or SNUCI. Matters of design and management aside, the goal for each country should be to have a system of protected areas representative of the biodiversity of the country as a whole. Ideally, that means relatively pristine natural areas, although there may well be instances in which there are no pristine ones for some or a particular ecosystem type. And in that case, appropriate restoration becomes an added element. Brazil has made major progress in building such a protected area system, and it is very positive that there is now similar action at the state level here in Brazil. An interesting restoration example is that of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay, the bay shown on this image, is North America's largest estuary. It is quite large, and it has a watershed that reaches from the mid-Atlantic all the way up into northern New York State, in fact, not very far from the Canadian border. It is a huge management challenge involving point pollution sources like factories, now largely under control, and non-point pollution such as agricultural runoff. The American oyster population, for which the bay is famous, and today filters a volume of water equal to the entire bay once a year. More than 100 years ago, as you can see in this slide, in the 1890s, when the population was at its normal size, literally the oysters filtered a volume equal to the entire bay once a week, with very obvious benefits for water quality. It is an example of a single species performing an ecological service. So part of the bay restoration is a program to start new oyster beds. As we noted earlier, scientific knowledge of biodiversity is still relatively superficial. So usually planning for a protected area system has to be based on approximations of what the real biogeography, which means the geography of biodiversity, what the real biogeography may be. Unfortunately, pressures on wild areas are such that conservation does not have the luxury of proceeding in a linear fashion and conducting a comprehensive biological inventory before designing a protected area system. So basically, the approach has to be iterative, to choose protected areas on the basis of current knowledge and to modify and augment as additional knowledge indicates in the future. It would make enormous sense for each country to undertake an ambitious biological inventory so that in the end there is knowledge of what species exist and where they are located. On a global scale, this would be an ambitious undertaking, but much less costly than and every bit as exciting as, and probably more exciting than, a lot of space exploration. In terms of immediate human interest and payoff, it would be enormously beneficial, not only providing the basic information for an adequate protected area system, but also laying the groundwork for great advances in both pure and applied life sciences. There are few countries in the world where there is good existing inventory, and the United Kingdom undoubtedly leads the list. There are equally few where there is an active, ongoing national inventory, such as Costa Rica's effort led by the Instituto Nacional de Biodiversidade in Bio. No nation, not even the United Kingdom, has the necessary expertise and reference collections for all groups of organisms. So inventory is by its very nature an international collaborative exercise. Efforts to protect national biological patrimony must be carefully designed so as not to inhibit this basic science that is so necessary both to biodiversity conservation and to realization of economic benefits from biodiversity. Around the world, certain nations have greater concentrations of biodiversity than others and have come to be known as mega diversity countries. And Brazil clearly is prominent among them. There are also a number of places, whoops, I think we missed one. Anyway, a number of places around the world known as biodiversity hotspots where there are major concentrations of species with restricted distributions, also under a great deal of threat. I like to say this is where the conservation fire engines should be sent first. The Mata Atlântica and the Cerrado are two of the global hotspots, and of course are major priorities for conservation nationally here in Brazil. A protected area system is only part of what needs to be done. Basically, there is a need for biologically functional landscapes everywhere. For example, at the moment, about 40% of the Brazilian Amazon is under some form of protection, a truly impressive achievement. Yet the hydrological cycle, so critical for the maintenance of Amazonian rainfall, is dependent on the forest itself. So the current protected areas would fail for lack of sufficient rain were the unthinkable to happen, and the remaining 60% to be converted to annual crops or grasslands. At a certain point, as deforestation progresses, a tipping point, a point of no return will be reached, leading to degradation of the cycle and drying of the Amazon basin, its forest, and major loss of its biodiversity. Nobody knows exactly where the tipping point is. And we know it is not a simple number of, for example, 25% or 30% deforestation. It is more complex than that because deforestation has different degrees of effect in different places. It is also important to build in a margin of safety in case El Niño drought or climate change provide a synergistic negative effect. There is a vital need for a computer model that can measure the potential impact of possible development projects. And it is also totally clear that there is no sense in discovering the tipping point by causing it to tip. Yet, each year's deforestation brings it closer, and I, for one, believe it cannot be very far away. Basically, the Amazon has to be managed and conserved as a system. And that automatically means all 8 countries have to be involved. This is a very important part of the Treaty on Amazon Cooperation, and one in which the Brazilian government is playing an important role ever since Fernando Henrique Cardoso provided the necessary leadership. The new permanent secretariat in Brasilia provides a solid base for such activities and is led by the very capable Secretary General Rosalia Arteaga. The Pantanal presents a similar management challenge. It too has to be managed as a system. The world's largest wetland basically acts like a giant sponge, soaking up and storing moisture in the wet season and then slowly letting it out during the dry season. It is, of course, very vulnerable to hydrological modifications, which is why Brazil played an important role in discouraging the ambitious hydrovia plans of a decade past. It is basically a 3-nation system and has to be managed jointly. In a sense, people everywhere need to move from a model in which nature and biodiversity exist in little protected patches and all the rest of the landscape is available for people to do whatever they wish. We need to move from that to a model in which we live within nature, and nature is a connected matrix. This does not mean we all have to turn into nature lovers and hunter-gatherers. Indeed, with current human numbers, it is impossible for the entire world population to exist as hunter-gatherers. It is equally impossible for the entire world to live the high-consumption, developed world lifestyle. The answer lies somewhere in between, and probably with some models that we have yet to imagine. Livable cities, there's a place in this model for intensive use, such as agriculture and such as cities. Indeed, livable cities are very much a part of what it takes to maintain enough nature for biodiversity to be conserved and to provide its goods and services. There is a need for a major transformation from the old model to a new model because the scale and rate of human impact on the rest of life on Earth has become monumental. Scientists estimate that human activity has raised the normal extinction rate by a factor of 1,000. Governance obviously plays a central role in whether biodiversity conservation is successful or not. And governance in turn depends on public awareness as an enabling condition for political will. As for governance, certainly the benefit-sharing provisions of the Convention on Biological Diversity provide a much greater incentive for nations to conserve their own resources, since they will receive the greatest benefit. Beyond that, I personally have no particular preference for regulatory or for market approaches. I am basically interested in whatever actually works, and recognize that certain approaches work better depending on the society involved. We certainly have seen examples where market approaches have worked well, as in the reduction of acid rain caused by sulfur from coal-fired power plants in the United States. To all of the above, we now have to add the impact of climate change, driven by the increase of greenhouse gases. We now know that nature is stirring, responding to the climate change that has already taken place. Earlier flowering, earlier nesting, different migration times have been recorded, as well as change in species distributions as organisms try to track their needed conditions. And this is a matter not only of temperature, but also of precipitation, and indeed of atmospheric composition.